Oh, thank you very much. My goal today is to present briefly the work we have been doing in pilot strategy, which is a European project studying potential CO2 storage areas in the various regions. I will focus mainly on the work we have been mainly research, social research we have been conducting on one of the sites, the Spanish site, but also we have been doing this in the other countries. So, and I will try to develop some recommendations for future or other commercial or pilot projects. Uh, so, pilot very briefly is a European funded project studying, investigating CO2 potential CO2 storage sites in 5 countries. Rowena and Paula, they are here, so they know more about the project than me. They can explain you later. Uh, specifically in 3 sites in Spain, Portugal, and France, we have been conducting research on social acceptance and also research on community engagement, and that's part of the presentation today. So generally, we can say that in pilot research on social acceptance is an important pillar, is one of the work packages, but it's also somehow integrated in the 3 communities with the technical geologist teams. And we have been treating somehow the communities, the 3 communities, as a living laboratories to understand how attitudes toward CO2 storage projects are formed in the beginnings, right? Because this is exploration, this is pilot scientific investigation mainly. Uh, Also, how public engagement from information to more participatory mechanisms can be developed in these communities. And of course, as the other presenters were saying, how this allow for us, how the socio-technical integration of these projects develop. Of course, the end goal is to develop insights for developing more socially aware and more integrated CCS projects in the present and in the future when we have commercial projects. We had mainly four research questions from the social science perspective. Basically, how local attitudes to CO2 storage projects are formed, how they are developed, how their local residents perceive the benefits, the risks of a project, how different emotions are built, what are the drivers of acceptance, why some people in communities will mainly accept the project or reject the project, what are the conditions to allow the acceptance of these projects, um, what kind of methods of engagement from information to consultation to participation can be developed to allow for this social integration and social acceptance. And and then, of course, well, this will be something we can develop in the conclusion, but how can we go from more passive information acceptance to more integration of the project in the local communities? Um, we have this in our working pilot. We have this model, theoretical model from previous research that basically says that we have some things that we can control and other things that we cannot really control from the perspective of the project developers. Uh, the main determinants of rejection, acceptance, or even identification with the project comes from these 4 pillars, which are the trust the residents have in the promoter, the perceived benefits and risks of the project, global and local. I will discuss this briefly. The emotions that the residents associate with the project, not only with the technology, but also with the project, of course. And then something called in the literature procedure legitimacy, which is somehow if the project takes into account the residents' views and if the residents perceive that the project is somehow taking care of their needs and their perspectives, right? Then we have other things that we cannot control unless, and this is the point of social characterization, we somehow select the community based on the social characterization. because, of course, some communities are different than others, and some residents have prior values, orientations, socioeconomic characteristics that are somehow not under the control of the public engagement team of the project, right? So we can not influence on this, but the project can somehow influence on these four factors. Well, the Lopin side, very briefly. I think you know somehow because Paula has been talking about this project in the last years, but we are focusing now today in the Lopin site, which is is a small rural area. Um, it's located in a in a low-dense rural area, south of Zaragoza. It's mainly an agricultural area with agricultural, livestock activity, some mining and industrial activity. What we have been doing in this area, but also in Portugal and France, uh, is applying this mixed method approach, basically social research, but somehow you can say that it's also information, consultation, and participation uh, at a small scale, right? So we have been doing a characterization of the community. We have been doing stakeholder interviews in the three areas, a resident survey, then stakeholder committees through the years of the project, and also somehow a small engagement with local residents to understand their views and also to present the project, right? So this somehow is the method. As I say, it's a social research method, but it can also be uh, understood as a public engagement mixed method. Well, some key results. First, acceptability. What we found first the first year via this survey we implemented in the area, we found, and of course, this is very how to say, this is an approximation, of course, as also always in social research, it's just an approximation. But we found moderate levels of acceptance. That means 5 out of 10 residents, we can say that they like the project, like the idea, and will accept a potential CO2 storage in the area. We have 2 out of 10 that are somehow ambivalent, and then we have 3 out of 10 that, in principle, they are against the project. Well, this is too much. This is too few. How do we know? Well, we know, for instance, that in other areas we have lower levels of acceptance that we have researched previously in other countries. We're talking about local acceptance. I mean, acceptance of a specific project, not the technology in general. And then we also know, for instance, that acceptance is usually a bit higher for CCU projects, which was our first hypothesis in other projects. So, it's always slightly higher the acceptance for CCU than for CCS. But anyway, we find here that at least 5 out of 10 are positive about the project. Uh, as you can see, if we have more detail on the acceptance or the acceptability, uh, we find that 2 out of 10 are really against the project, right? Uh, then 1, 2 out of 10 is against, but not totally against, right? And then the neutral, the ambivalent people is very important because it's what we should expect more in principle because people is not aware of the project. And on the other hand, neutrals are usually the people, the participants or the residents that can change according to how the project is introduced, presented, and so on. So we can have more influence on the neutrals than on the totally against the project, right? Uh, regarding the perceived benefits, because what is driving acceptance? Well, in part, as I say with the model, in part, acceptance is being driven by how the residents perceive the benefits of the project. And here, based on our small work group, work with groups of residents, we know that, for instance, when we give information about CO2 storage projects, people really understand somehow the global benefits, but then they want to discuss about the local benefits, right? So there's a tension between, yeah, this has global benefits, but what are the local benefits? And of course, the global benefits are usually easily understood for stakeholders. For the residents, they really pay more attention to the local and tangible. So the third point here says the residents tend to focus on potential socioeconomic impact, and they really think that it can bring job creation, investments, and potential compensations. So they really like to discuss this. They really like to know about this. Of course, they like to know about the global benefits, but usually residents in our area at least usually focus on the local benefits. Um, the benefits, as I say, are more clearly perceived by the stakeholders than by the local residents, which is normal, right? Because level of knowledge and familiarity are different, and initially are very low in our areas. So somehow we have to think always in terms of two big types of benefits. We might be interested in the environmental and strategic benefits of CCS, but local residents are usually more interested in the local economic and community development. Of course, this might vary with the type of community we are facing, right? And the type of residents we have. Depends on the values and the needs and the aspirations of the community, which is another point that I will like to develop. Uh, for the risks, we have to understand that we have usually negativity bias. People is more prone to risk than to benefits. The mental models we find are different than the models you might have. I don't have time to go into this, but you see the surface differently than normal residents, normal lay people. They're usually concerned about the fairness of the impacts. And then trust is here very important. Trust somehow interferes with everything. People is concerned in our communities about the safety and environmental risk, of course, but then you see when you listen to them that social risks, economic risks, political risks are also part of the how they try to understand the problem. And this is based usually in lack of trust on higher levels of trust. And of course, this can be part of the project, or it can be also part of the tradition in the community, right? It's not the same a community in Norway than in Italy or Spain, of course. So we have previous levels of trust that might be lower or higher. We studied a bit very briefly, but the emotions. What are the emotions associated with the project? And this is important because it drives also acceptance and rejection. And here, but this is just a very small sample, right? But we have surprise, which is positive emotion, right? I think because they are surprised about the technology and how the technology works. But then, as you see, we don't have a lot of hope. uh, we have curiosity, which is positive, but then we have skepticism and fear also. I think we have to future projects, public engagement teams should work with these emotions also. It's very important. And then finally, what are the conditions of acceptance? Under which conditions will they accept the project? And usually in the stakeholders and the residents, we find these four elements that are very important. Local benefits is the first. Uh, Information, transparency, and so on is the second. Safety, of course, and compensations. What are the compensations to the local community? These are the drivers of acceptance for people that accept the project and also for the neutral. Uh, so I conclude with some key strategies. But the main idea here then is that usually in CCS, we would like to avoid site rejection, right? Withdrawal. This is the main thing, right? And we would like to go for acceptance or tolerance. But of course, the idea is that we could also work on promoting higher levels of acceptance, right? Ideally, I would say ideally, CCS projects could work to promote support, local support, and even in the literature and the social license, they call local identification, psychological identification with the project. Of course, this is an ideal state where the community is really, really integrated with the project. But anyway, if we want to do this from our small experience with these communities, we think that early continuous engagement is important to listen to the residents, to understand their views and needs, building trust from the beginning. And trust, the interesting thing is that usually scientists thing that is based on expertise, but mainly on empathy and honesty. And this is the main driver of trust. And it's in fact very automatic, right? How trust is built within the residents. Of course, we have to enhance the perceived local benefits of future CCS storage sites projects. Uh, this might be based on indirect benefits or potential compensations. Of course, this should be aligned with community values, with community needs or community aspirations. Uh, I think we have to foster positive emotions um, through trust, through a compelling, of course, honest narrative. Uh, for instance, I don't think the narrative of storing a waste is a very good narrative. We could work on better narratives. Um, then we can initially select more favorable communities. This is called social characterization. And of course, as other literature say for other technologies, we have to foster local embeddedness, as the other speakers were emphasizing. So we have to integrate the projects into existing traditions, existing infrastructures, into the existing context. This is just like some examples of what we could work in the future in our community, because part of pilot is developing recommendations. Some are very easy, some are more complex, but and of course all the CCS projects can select what kind of engagement work they are willing to do, right? The minimum, as you know, is information, providing information, a website being open, right? The maximum is creating these co-managed community development funds or uh, community groups, right? To gather concerns, to listen to the residents, to listen to the stakeholders, which, as Paula will say, it has been working very good, for instance, in pilot in our community, working with the stakeholders specifically, because they are usually more interested than the residents. But you can do different things, right? How you design the facilities of the CCS, of the storage facilities, right? How you design them to be more embedded in the local context. Uh, how you emphasize, for instance, in campaigns, how some residents or some stakeholders are benefiting from the project, right? This is just an idea. For instance, how a olive farmer uh, has seen how the project is improving his irrigation system in the area, right? These are just examples of how can we foster also positive emotions linked to the CCS project. And I think that's it. I'm fine. No? Thank you.